Good morning. My name is Anna Chevet. I serve as Associate General Counsel here at the U.S. Copyright Office. I will be moderating our next panel, Creating Comprehensive Databases, Past, Present, and Future. Before we begin, just to provide a bit of context for today's panel, so as previously discussed, the MLC will be building a new public musical works database that will link sound recordings with their underlying musical works. So today, this panel is going to discuss past and current efforts to build comprehensive databases for the identification and ownership of musical works, and embodied in sound recordings. In addition, the panel is going to discuss data exchange formats and protocols that are used to make data exchange more efficient within the music industry. So thank you very much for our esteemed panelists here today, who I will go ahead and introduce, so their bios are in with your agenda. So to my immediate left, I have Mark Ursherwood. Mark serves as Secretariat of Digital Data Exchange, LLC, also known as DDEX, where he has served as a secretariat since its incorporation in 2006. Next, we have Michelle Alain. Michelle recently joined the World Intellectual Property Organization, otherwise known as WIPO, as Copyright IT Manager. In the past, he served for 10 years as the Chief Information Officer of the French Society of Authors, Composers, and Publishers of Music. Next, we have David Hughes. David serves as Chief Technologist at the Recording Industry Association of America. Next, we have John Simpson. John has served in many positions in the music industry, including as Executive Director of Sound Exchange from 2001 to 2010. He currently serves as counsel at Fox Rothschild and serves as Program Director for the Business and Entertainment Program Department of Management at American University. Last, we have Nicole Davis. Nicole serves as Senior Director of Berklee's Institute for Creative Entrepreneurship and leads the Open Music Initiative, a consortium focused on streamlining metadata and payment tracking for artists. So thank you again very much for our panelists. So Mark, let's start with you. So as the Secretariat for DDEX, if you could please describe what DDEX is, like what it does, and the role it plays in standardizing data that goes into databases for collection societies and otherwise.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Isherwood. I'm part of the Secretariat for DDEX. So DDEX is a not-for-profit membership organization, and we are a standards-setting organization. And the focus of the work we do is the standardization of the communication of data between all the different business partners that exist within the music industry value chain. And we do this in kind of three ways. One is we specify standard formats that contain the data. So in the days when you had to fill out your IRS filing on paper, the form would be the same for everybody. But obviously the data that you then put into it about how much you've earned and what's tax deductible would be different. And essentially that's what DDEX is doing, is creating the form into which everybody puts their data, which will be unique to them as it moves around the whole music industry ecosystem. The second piece is to create standard choreographies around those messages. So if I send...
What do you mean by a standard?
I'm going to
say.
So if I send a particular message to a business partner, then the choreography would expect that business partner to send a specific message back to me, and that would be part of of how between us we manage the exchange of data around a particular type of business transaction. And one perhaps obvious one that's relevant here would be a DSP sending a license request message to a rights owner, and a rights owner sending a license grant message back at its simplest level. And then the third piece is actually the standardization of the methods by which those messages actually get transmitted, whether that's through the format or the message being actually placed on an SFTP site, or whether using web services where there's much more automation where there's much more computer-to-computer conversations going on and less human interaction. So those are the three sort of areas where DDEX is specifying what's needed. And one of your handouts, actually, I'll walk you through quickly, shows all of the different standards or families of standards that we've got. And we've used the London Tube map as a way of doing it. And yes, we did ask their permission. So interestingly, they don't charge a royalty. So basically, the first three on the deck are really a set of standards that involve communication between labels, distributors, and DSPs. And the first one is the release delivery standard, which is basically the exchange of data from a record company or a distributor to a DSP, which sets out the nature of the sound recordings and releases that the record company or distributor is allowing the DSP to actually put on their service. So that's obviously things like, title, track duration, artists, other contributors, and so on. And those messages also contain what we call deal information, and that is where the record company is basically saying you can use this track from the 1st of January, and you charge 2 cents a stream or whatever it happens to be, but you can only do this for the US. That when it comes to 1st of February, you can do it for Canada as well. So it's kind of setting the parameters by which the DSP can actually use sound recordings in accordance with the overarching physical contract that they've negotiated between them. Within the context of that, we've also specified the way in which the actual files, the binaries, get communicated between all the parties involved, from the studio to the label, and then on to the DSP. And that can also include things like archiving services where labels are ensuring that their sound recordings are archived properly for posterity. And then the final one is a very new standard which was only published in September, which we call the Mead standard. And this is data that I describe as not to do with product delivery or with rights management. It's things like how many Grammys has this artist won? It's which film soundtrack did this song appear in? It's this other information that as consumers we're actually probably a lot more interested in than the rights management and product delivery stuff that is obviously important to that process. And that's a new standard, and that allows metadata companies as well as the labels to provide data of the kind that I've just described to DSPs to help enhance the information they can give to us as consumers. And Richard already mentioned that a number of the services are working very hard to carry a lot more contributor information, particularly writer and composer information, but also who played alto sax on that particular track and so on.
Just want to add voice services.
Yeah. And I mean the Mead thing really came about because of the voice services and the way in which we, as those of us who are not in the business, ask questions of our voice service, needs certain types of data that you wouldn't certainly wouldn't be forming part of your rights management or product release data. The next group of standards, the sales and usage reporting, and that enables the DSPs to send sales and usage reporting to any form of rights owner. We will be shortly declaring, which is the second slide on the second page, something called the claim detail message. This applies primarily to musical works and is used a lot more extensively in Europe and Asia than perhaps it is over here. But this is a response from rights owners saying, I claim X percentage share of this particular work that was in the usage report that you sent me. And then the next group is the musical work notification and licensing, and these are going to be potentially quite important to the MLC. These allow publishers to make claims at a right share level to people who are using their repertoire, and also to make changes to those claims when publishing catalogues move from one company to another. So that group there of the DSR, the claim detail message, and the musical work notification and licensing are all potentially very important in the context of the MLC. The DSR may well be the mechanism by which the licensees are going to report to the MLC. So a lot of these things are all already in place and being very widely used across the industry.
So can you talk more when you talk about sending messages kind of back and forth? Maybe talk a little bit for people in the audience who might not know. What do you mean by sending a message?
So if I want a business partner to have and understand my data, which then allows them to carry out some business transaction, the way in which I do that is by extracting that data from my database, putting it into a communication format, sending it to the business partner, and then they ingest that data into their systems in order to carry out whatever transaction it happens to be. Now, frankly, that's a hugely clunky and old-fashioned way of doing things. Other industries who are into the sort of level of transactions that we are, a lot of that's done computer to computer. That doesn't involve messages per se, but actually computers communicating directly with each other. And that's gradually how the music industry is beginning to move as well. And so that's really the role that we're playing. And as I said, although at the moment it's mostly messages being put onto FTP sites, increasingly the membership of DDEX is moving towards the use of web services and APIs so that it's a much more automated process, which is going to obviously improve efficiencies and reduce costs.
Could you maybe talk, because you're talking about also different messages or
Yep.
different standards. So how does DDEX go about developing a new standard, deciding which information should be included in that standard?
So the way in which, the process we go through is that the membership will sit down and determine a set of requirements for a particular message or a change to a message. And then the Secretariat will make a proposal as to how that requirement can be met. And then we go through an iterative period of making sure it actually does what we all want it to do.
And how do you build consensus in deciding that it does what it is
Well,
supposed to do?
I don't know. I don't know how we do it, but we do. We've worked very hard to create an atmosphere within DDEX which is entirely not confrontational. And partly that's because we have a room full of operational and IT people whose kind of raison d'etre is to solve problems. Because if they don't solve them, their life becomes a bigger nightmare than it is already. And so there is a very strong sense of working together, even if you're dealing with companies that at a commercial or legal level may actually be litigating each other. So, we have Spotify in the room, and, they're not entirely popular with the publishing community, but we have publishers in the room as well, and they're all talking to each other and trying to find solutions. And so the atmosphere is very conducive to building that consensus.
And maybe one last question before we move on to Michelle is, so are DDEX standards available only to members? Are
No.
they free, or how does that work?
No, so the standards, basically what we do is we will publish standards, and they're on a public website, and anybody can use them for free. They just need to take out an implementation license. You do not have to be a member to use the standards. The reason for being a member, though, is that you're part of that conversation in actually determining the way in which we move forward. There are some other standards that are written on this pack, so I'm aware that I could go on for hours. The only one I would just emphasize, which has already been mentioned, is all of these transactions that are listed here. Where does the data come from in the first place? It comes from the studio, it comes from the creators. And that's where our recorded information notification standard, which is more of a file than an actual message, we're working with a lot of DAW manufacturers and the studio community in general to integrate. sorry, digital audio workstation, sorry. Acronym is the way we live in DDEX, I do apologize. And the whole point of this is to encourage creators and artists of whatever denomination to actually be gathering this metadata at source whilst they're doing it. Now, clearly, that kind of studio world doesn't exist to the extent that it used to, and some people are doing this in their bedroom. And so we've got to look to extend it to other areas as well. But that is where collection of this data starts. And one of the things that DDEX is doing a lot more of recently, and will be doing so into next year, is working a lot more with artist and composer representative organizations to try and foster this approach to grabbing as much of the metadata as you can at source so that it can feed into various points within the value chain.
Great. Well, thank you so much. So we're going to continue discussion of data formats and move to Michelle. So Michelle, if you could please describe the Common Works registration, otherwise known as CWR, and maybe explain, who developed CWR, what's its purpose, and maybe how it's different than DDEX standards.
Yeah, so hi everybody, I'm Michel. I'm now working at WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, a United Nations agency in charge of intellectual property. And you raised the question of CWR, and I think that before answering to that, maybe we need to introduce this concept of works, because the CWR is linked to the work, is the Common Work Registration format. So in fact, at the beginning, you have some creators. They are going to create what we call a work. A work is not a sound recording, and I think it's maybe very important to make that difference, because we can see that we will have this split between work and sound recording during all the value chain of the music. And here we're speaking about unclaimed royalties. So if we have unclaimed royalties, it means that some right holders did not receive the money they should have. So in fact, when the creators they are going to create a work, so it's a composition of the brain, a spirit, a creation, and they will need to register it. And for that, they are going to use some society, can be a performing right organization or a mechanical right organization. They will assign their rights. They will make a contract with a publisher, and the publisher will be in charge of representing the work. And the publisher will have to register the work toward at a performing right organization or mechanical right organization. The publisher, he can do it on several ways: filling paper, going on the website, or sending a file. And that's why the CWR has been created, the Common Work Registration file. It's a file format for publisher to register the work. It's been created by CISAC and Publishers Organization. It's, I would say that it's used by most of main publishers. I think that it's quite a complex format. It's not necessarily an easy one, and I know that it's not always easy for some smaller publisher to use it, so that's why you have some software. You have also some service provider doing that. But it is sure that you still have some publisher doing some using Excel or some other solution to make the work registration.
Great. Maybe shifting gears a little bit to talk about past efforts to create comprehensive databases. So if you could please describe, Michelle, the Global Repertoire Database effort, otherwise known as GRD.
I was very happy to be here.
I was there and happy to talk about it. I mean, not happy.
Okay, so Back to the Future, GRD. So GRD, it was an initiative. It's coming. Yeah, we were Mark also. We were in that adventure. So in fact, everything has started in 2005 with a European regulation, recommendation, not regulation. It was a recommendation for creating a pan-European market for licensing for the digital business. So following that recommendation of the European Commission, publishers were able to have pan-European license. So before we were in a world where SACEM was licensing France, GEMA licensing Germany, PRS UK, and after 2005, 2006, it was the beginning of some pan-European deal. And for example, Sony gave the right to GEMA and Universal to SACEM. So of course, after that, it became quite difficult to do the day-to-day business because it was very difficult to know who is having which right and where to go to get a license. And the European Commission started a group of thinking about the solution. And if I well remember, the project started in 2009 for creating what was so-called the GRD, the Global Repertoire Database. So it started with some publishers, some societies, and also some creators. So we go through a process of RFP, RFI. We hired some consultant, and we move forward. Finally, as you know, the project was terminated because we did not succeed in financing the project. It was really a problem of funding the project.
So you're saying it's a problem of funding. And John, maybe you can talk to this a little bit too. I think in looking at past efforts, it would be interesting, I think, for today to talk about what those challenges were. Maybe it was funding, maybe it was something else in addition to funding. But if there were, maybe if the overall project was not successful, maybe that there were certain successes that actually did occur.
Well, there were neighboring rights societies as well involved in that meeting in Switzerland. And I think one of the things that killed it was when Google offered to fund it. And the rights owners really basically had a revolt that they were not going to let them own the data.
No.
You're switching IMR.
You're switching.
and GRD.
Yes, it's not the same.
No. It was
No.
no. It was GRD.
No.
Oh yeah. Sorry, Jim.
We're getting there. That's next.
Oh, it's next. Okay.
Yeah, that's next. Yeah.
Okay, so why
No.
don't we move to...
It was the other. You had two initiatives. You had one initiative was GRD, Global Repertoire Database, and at the same time another initiative, more or less at the same time, that was IMR. It was launched by WIPO, the organization I'm working for now. But I was not there at this moment. At this period of time, I was.
That's okay. So why actually, David, since IMR came up, also known as the International Music Registry, maybe, David, you can talk a little bit about IMR, and then maybe collectively we can talk about the challenges that were faced by both of those efforts.
Very unlike me, I'm going to refer to notes because this all happened more than a decade ago, and I can't remember that far back. So we're going to talk about IMR. That was the International Music Rights Registry. And I think it's kind of an exemplar of many of the other attempts that we probably won't have time to discuss today. And let me just say, they had the best of intentions, okay? So the idea was to create a music ownership database. And this started back in 2011 or so, and was born out of WIPO before Michel's time. So he's he's not responsible. And it was envisioned to be a database, a comprehensive database for musical works and sound recordings. One of our friends, Bendik, was put in charge of it, and The idea was a sort of a emerging copyright licensing modality session happened in Geneva, and the outbirth of that was, well, we need an international music registry with all the rights. And we need to make it faster and simpler, and as I said, it was all the best of intentions. And WIPO stepped up and proposed that they would back it and create this reliable, authoritative source of information. But as with many other initiatives, it was not successful. And to cut to the chase, I will say for two main reasons that I can recall. The first one was they were biting off far more than they could ever chew, and choked on it. The idea was to have musical licenses, musical works licenses, and sound recording licenses for international in a single database. So I just want to talk very briefly about what I call the 3D complexity of music licensing. And we touched on this before. What that really means is you would have to have a database that tells every single license by territory, by time frame, and by usage. So if somebody goes to license for a streaming service back in the day, it's getting better now, in Europe, and they say, I want to do an on-demand streaming service in Italy. They go, okay, great. Go to these guys and talk to it for the catalog. Yeah, but I want to do all of Europe. Oh, well, then you have to go to these guys, and these guys, and these guys, and these guys, and these guys. And what about Asia? Oh, that's different. And then, I want to do a passive and an on-demand service. Oh, well, we've licensed those rights to somebody else. Or if you want sync licenses, or you want broadcast, and it could be slice and dice. It can be so complex that Elisa said something great, which was as complex as the MLC is, it's a very narrow. You pick one usage, mechanical licensing, in one territory, the United States, with the time periods, which will change over time as catalogs move or whatever, and that is a big enough lift. I think every other initiative that did not limit itself to a quote, Elisa again, very narrow. That's the only way you can do this. And so...
So what was the other reason?
So the other reason was Google stepped up and offered to fund it. And at that point, I think everybody got really scared and walked away, to be honest.
There are a couple of points I would make about this. Firstly, we look back at both of these and with some mirth, but actually nobody is saying we don't need a database of this kind even now. And if GRD had been successful 5 years on now, think where we would be. And the other thing I would say, technology is not the problem with any of these things. People are the problem. It's vested interests and people who don't want these things to happen. And that's why it was very warming to hear the earlier panel about how much work the MLC is doing towards getting out there and explaining what this is to the community to whom it affects.
And working collaboratively with the
exactly.
DLC, right?
With one of the things I think GRD did wrong was not to do enough evangelizing of what it was that we were trying to do. So over here, GRD was seen as a European project for a European problem. It wasn't. But once that mindset had set in, actually breaking that down and saying, no, you've got the same problem, and hey ho, we've got the MLC, same problem that you're trying to solve. So that to me, those two things is you have to engage all of the community all the time, and people are the problem, not the technology.
Yeah. If I could just amplify that, because I think that's so spot on, Mark. In 2007, 7 of the largest neighboring rights societies got together to build a database. And we all realized that the same companies in every territory, the major labels, were paying for the databases we were all building on our own. So we all got together and we had many, many meetings. And we were making a lot of progress. And there have been the International Performer Database, the VRDB. There are some databases out there that have been overseen by SCAPRA and some other bodies. But ultimately, what happened is there was a fear that the British PPL and the U.S. Sound Exchange were going to control this, and it basically got scuttled. Just infighting. And so it was people, not technology. And it was a great idea to basically pool our resources, build one back office for all these different societies.
I think there's one other issue, and that is the fact of existing business practices that cannot be, not that they're necessarily good, but we start with player pianos and we just layer on copyright law over the years to try to build out for each new usage and for each new problem. And it is cobbled together, and the way we do business is not uniform.
But that's where I would say we're talking about people who are not prepared to change. They kind
Yeah.
of like it the way it is, however stupid it happens to be.
Yes.
And
So either you need to do those colossal changes. Well, copyright reform.
and that's what the MLC is doing. It's saying we're going to change this. We're going to do it a completely different way, and these are the
But
consequences.
not try to change everything. Try to fix one problem at a time or something.
Well, and let's maybe talk also about current efforts, which I know you are excited to talk about, David, Music Data Exchange, otherwise known as MDX. But maybe not everyone is familiar with MDX, how it works. But this also is something new that my understanding is a collaborative effort. So I think that would be interesting to hear about.
So I am going to talk to this later today. Ali Lieberman, who is the project manager for MDX, will be able to answer all the detailed questions that I cannot. She's on the panel this afternoon, and we'll get into the deeper dive. I'm going to talk at a higher level about the history and what it was designed to accomplish and so on. So the members of the NMPA and RIA created a committee, a joint committee we call the Best Practice Working Group. This is basically created because of the pending and unmatched problems that we had that resulted in MOUs and so on. And going back now 7 years, every 6 to 12 months, face-to-face meeting with all of the, and this is the important part, all of the actual hands-on experts who deal with these problems of data and matching and royalty processing and so on. We get in a room, and these experts, and they really are, I mean, this is, sometimes we have expert groups where people are like me and they're just sort of generalists, but we have the actual experts in the room. And they have been working on this now for 7 years, working out all the best practices. During that time, in a parallel initiative, the NMPA put out an RFP because they realized that there was a need to build a portal to help publishers and users of musical works somehow find each other so that they could get the proper licenses in place. Sound Exchange responded to this RFP, and it sort of rolled into the work that had been done by the best practices, and they started to build 3 years ago now, I think, a platform. And the platform is to deal with the fact that we need a centralized process where labels can request publishing data and publishers can respond and they can link up and you can find out where to get a license and get a license in place before the product goes into the market. That's really what MDX is designed to do. So I know it's a little vague. I made a couple of notes here that would hopefully describe a little bit better what it is.
Will DSPs ever use MDX, or is this exclusively for labels and publishers?
So the way it's set up now is that when the labels are trying to secure the mechanical licenses for new works, this is for new works only right now, the way it's set up for use. As soon as a new work's created and as soon as a sound recording is being created and the label realizes, okay, this is a new work, they then go into the portal and they put that information into the MDX portal. And what you have to understand is that before MDX, people like Jay Gress at Sony Music, who will be on the panel later, would say, okay, well, there's 5 songwriters, and in the past, those songwriters were affiliated with these 7 publishers. So we're going to send out these 35 emails and ask all these guys, hey, is your writer associated with this? And it's a brand new work created in the studio the day before, perhaps, so the publisher doesn't even know that it exists yet. So they say, well, it is our writer, but we don't know about that. And it would go back and forth, and so it was super inefficient. And the idea.
What does MDX do to
Right. So
simplify that?
MDX is you go in there when a sound recording is being created, you put in all the information that you understand that relates to the work. So you put in the writers, and you can indicate if you think you know who the publishers are. But in the end, it goes up into a central place where all the publishers can then set up alerts for their writers and the publishing companies they're affiliated with or so on. Then they'll get a message, and then they can go in there. And the idea is that if the sound recording owner and the musical work owner both agree that this is a sound recording of this musical work, unless somebody else is challenging that, we assume that it's authoritative. I don't know if we use that word, but we assume it's correct and that business can be conducted on that. And that, in a nutshell, is what it is. I think Ali's going to talk more detail later. But
That'd be great. So maybe, like, how is it different than this to-be-created MLC database?
that's a great question. And I think that really...
That Ali should answer later, or
No,
are you going to?
I'm happy to answer that question. So think of it conceptually. To do this, you need 3 sets of data. You need sound recording data. You need musical work data. Let's call them databases for the purpose. And then you need a third database of the links between them. And that database has to also include who asserted the links, who verified the links, who has challenged the links, possibly. No. That's Adele sang a cover of Lionel Richie's Hello at Royal Albert Hall. That wasn't her song. Why is she getting paid the publishing? Lionel Richie should get paid. It gets complicated, okay? So then those 3 databases, I believe that the MLC will have to recreate that exact same functionality. And I think that everybody in the room who cares about how the MLC works should be seriously considering and understanding what MDX does, how it does it, the rule set it's based on, the best practices that took 7 years to create that it's based on, and don't ignore any of that. Now, the relationship between the MLC and MDX, I can't talk to that, but to ignore it or recreate it would be a waste of time and money, I believe. And I'm not shy. I pretty much told everybody I know in this room that already.
So thank you. I think, it's good to hear about MDX. I think we're here to learn about, and even Elisa alluded to this, just learning about what the different efforts have been and what they are doing to learn from them. Not to say what the MLC today should do. We're here to talk about what are options available. So maybe, David, it would be helpful very, very quickly, just in the interest of time, to talk about the recently announced Repertoire Data Exchange, or RDX project.
I'm less passionate about this. I only have 1 page.
Okay.
So RDX is a repertoire data exchange. This came out of IFPI and WIN. That's a worldwide indie network of independent labels. And it's supposed to be a central gateway to supply data in an accurate form for... Okay, so basically, it's about public performances and neighboring rights. Now, neighboring rights is a term that many people in the United States don't even know, but let's just put it this way. Public performance is what happens. Neighboring rights is the payment you get for that public performance. So in the UK, for example, in the United States, we have Sound Exchange for the digital aspects of that. But in the UK, there's PPL. And they keep track of everything in public performance that happens on the radio, broadcast, in bars, whatever, in the UK. And then at the end of that period, let's say it's monthly or quarterly, they send a report, for example, to Senna in the Netherlands. And then this giant report of every song that's been played in the UK during the past 3 months goes over to the Netherlands, and they look through it, and they look for any Dutch songs on that list. And they pull those out, and then they identify those, send it back to PPL and say, those are Dutch songs, and basically send an invoice to them and say, please send the money to us so we can distribute to the appropriate people in the Netherlands. Okay, not so bad, except that Senna has to do the same thing and send it to the UK. So now they're sending this massively large file to PPL. They have to wade through this giant file, pick out all the UK songs, and do the same thing, which would be okay if there were only 2 territories. But PPL actually has to do that with every territory, and Senna has to do that with every territory, and it is colossally inefficient. So, RDX is not exactly a database in the aspects of some of the databases we're talking about. It's more like a platform where you upload the stuff, and Susan Butler used the term, it's like a cache. You upload your recent playlist, let's call it, of what's been broadcast, and then all the other MLCs, the other MLC, music licensing companies, could then sort through it in one central place, pull out the stuff that's from their country, and contact and get their money. Does that make sense?
But it's also so the labels can send their repertoire to one place for dissemination to all of the MLCs.
Yes, and that's how the labels got involved as well, is to send it to one place.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So, John, turning to you, the International Music Joint Venture, IMJV, has kind of come up a little bit, and we've talked about past efforts. So if there's anything further you would like
That's
to say
real
about...
ancient history, that one.
Which one is that?
He was wearing short trousers when it was IMJB.
So I'll leave it to you, John, if you want to talk more about IMJV, or are you talking more about your experience with different collective management organizations?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, certainly these databases have to be incredibly nimble and flexible. I get involved in a lot of disputes where songs come out and they haven't even agreed on splits. And if you're a publisher or you're a record label and you've been asked to pay out splits and the splits add up to 175%, you basically put the money on hold and say, come back to me when you've figured out 100%. So that's a big problem. And sometimes the record comes out with 100% splits, and then there's a sample that wasn't, disclosed, and that person ends up with songwriting credit. I mean, it is a lot more complex in some ways, although our big problem in the early days of Sound Exchange in our database was who is the featured performer on a sound recording. And it may sound easy, but it's not. The other thing that was really interesting, we created Sound Exchange in the Mesozoic period, 2000, and there were very few databases for us to rely on. I mean, one of the wonderful things for the MLC is there's a lot more resource. There's a lot more technology. Back then, the major labels had actually built something called the SRDB, the sound recording database. It had about 480,000 titles, and that's actually what gave rise to the first Sound Exchange database. The RAAA lent it to us, and we used that to create something called the blanket license application. But those very early days, actually CATCO, which is the British PPL system, licensed the RAAA SRDB. That's where they built their system from. But the early days of Sound Exchange was very, very difficult because a lot of our data was basically given to us by the user companies, and the data was horrible. And
So what did you do to fix that issue?
it took us years and years and years. And the cleanup, I mean, PPL spent millions and millions of dollars to clean up their data, and they had much cleaner data than we did because in the UK, to get on the charts, you had to give PPL clean data of who was on a record and things of that nature. So it's very difficult, and you think it should be easy. So those early efforts were very, very difficult. And I think Alyssa was kind of commenting about, it's telling people you have money for them. I mean, in 2001, when we first had money for people, and again, we had tiny little bits of money, $3 million our first year. You'd call people up and say, oh, yeah, I need your social security number. I need your bank account information. We have money for you. And they go, you guy from Nigeria with the oil, and, are you from that lottery in the Netherlands? So, there was a lot of suspicion. There were a lot of people who turned down their money. And that continued to happen, where we would contact people and they would say, oh, I couldn't have earned this money. And that has to do with the education process, which I think is so critical. And if I can, I would really advise the DSPs. One of our biggest allies, frankly, and this came much later, Pandora in 2007, 2008, as they started to gain scale. When they would accept a recording, and you have to understand the Pandora system because it was that Music Genome Project, so they had to accept your recording. They would send a note to the artist saying, you will now be earning royalties from Sound Exchange. So, and here's the link to sign up. It was a wonderful tool, and it led to a lot of indie artists signing up with us. And I think the DSP should be doing that here for songwriting. So remember, they control the pipes. They're sending things out to tens of millions of people. We don't have anywhere near that reach, and we can't afford to pay for it. So if Spotify and Apple and Tidal can have some sort of a message about songwriters, if there's a way to have that database communicate, we don't have full information on this track. We need more information. It would be a great thing.
Can you also talk, please, John, you talked about how like the data was really poor and you had to spend a lot of money to clean it up. How about getting clean data from the get-go, like going forward? Like what measures did you take so that you didn't have to clean it up so that what you were getting initially was...
You know, working with licensees was really important to get them to care about it, but typically they had an intern inputting that stuff, or it was Grace Note. They would stick a CD back then in their computer and it would pop up with the tracks. One of the things I said that when I left Sound Exchange, I was going to start a band called Various Artists. They were going to be on Label Unknown, and the song was going to be called Bonus Track, and I would have been a multimillionaire immediately. So there's a ton of stuff like that that still exists out there. Another area that's massively problematic, not as much for the MLC, because most of this works in public domain, although there are probably arrangement credits. We had millions of dollars for Beethoven. I was sure he hadn't made a record and wasn't the recording artist. Or we had lots of money for all of the classical composers. Classical music stations typically tend to list the composer as the featured performer. It was a massive problem that we had to fix. Fortunately for us, the unions actually helped us fix it because most of those classical players were in the AFM. So they stepped up. But that's a really big problem.
Great, thank you so much. So Nicole, last but not least, it would be great if you could please describe the Open Music Initiative and the rules of protocols and data formats and setting standards for that initiative.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that I am the only one amongst us five without the battle scars to speak of. So I don't know if that gives me an advantage or disadvantage. But so Open Music Initiative was founded.
A lot less pain, isn't it?
I'll take it. So we founded Open Music Initiative 3 years ago at Berklee College of Music. It came out of work that we'd done with students. And, obviously at Berklee, we're focused on artists and music creation. And, we have within our campus, 5,000, 6,000 creators working across the entire value chain. So, studio to designing, how music's going to be consumed, PlayStation, Skywalker, Netflix. We sort of run the entire gamut. And we're passionate about music. And so I think, we were sort of discussing here, is it a data problem? Is it a people problem? What Open Music Initiative aimed to do, and we're 3 years in and sort of at an interesting point, is to bring the stakeholders together to address some of the people problems, but then also some of the sort of data and tech issues and see where we might be a value add. So we do that in 3 ways. First of all, with our co-leads at MIT Connection Science, we work on protocols and taking some learnings and best practices from other industries where, we were discussing, other industries are able to sort of transfer the data in much more automated and efficient ways. So what are different learnings that we can take and apply to the music industry? Second of all, coming out of Berklee, we are an education institution. And so how can we support education about intellectual property to creators, but then also sort of serve as this feedback loop within the industry? There was this really interesting moment for anybody who was at our LA meeting last February, where there was this really successful songwriter who has made a career for herself and supporting herself as a songwriter. And there was a panel talking about, ISWCs, you need to have one, da da da. And she turns to me, we were like, in the back, and she turns to me, she's like, what's an ISWC? And because I've been in the room with all of these folks, I know what an ISWC is. But she didn't, and she's been making a living as a songwriter, doing that, and yet, she still didn't know what this really critical piece is. So I think that, bringing these people together in one room is so important, and I think Mark spoke to that a bit. And then finally, we do believe that in order for artists to have sustainable, successful careers, we need to continue growing the pie as far as how artists are able to make money. So I think, we're talking a lot about streaming, obviously, and distribution through streaming, but there's going to continue to be other monetization opportunities for musicians and artists. So Open Music works, both to convene the industry around these issues, and then technologically to start experimenting and actually, rather than talking about it, actually show it through practice. And we're lucky to have, some of the top experimenters in technology with MIT to actually build some of these solutions just so we can kick the tires and see, what's realistic and how can we make change.
So I guess, how do you guys go about building consensus? I mean, you're talking about kicking the tires and trying things, but how do you decide, okay, this is what people want, this is working, and this is what we're going to do?
Yeah,
versus trying something else.
Yeah. I think that, it's a couple elements. I mean, I think similar to kind of what Mark said, being an education institution, being artist focused, and then bringing people around that core mission of, just love of music. Like, ultimately, that's why we're all here in this room. I think that that's really important. So we sort of start there. And then the other piece is having something to react to. So I think a lot of times, if you're sort of trying to decide a solution and just sort of like endlessly iterating on paper versus actually building something and understanding that like what we have may not be perfect, but knowing that we can react to it. So again, I think there's the human side and then there's the tech side, but I think that we're one of the few initiatives that does sort of bring together both like professionals, and we have, labels and streaming services and publishers. We have tons of startups, but then we have a lot of hobbyists and music technologists, sort of garage tinkerers, and we have a lot of artists engaged as well. And so I think that bringing together all of those voices in one room and then being able to roll up our sleeves and build things are sort of, those are two, ingredients of success.
So how does OMI complement or differ from, let's say, DDEX and
Yeah,
what
certainly.
it does?
That has been all right, David, I hope I get this right. Well, sure. So I think that we definitely do not aim to replicate the work of DDEX. What we do aim to do, and speaking of some of those hobbyists and artists out there who may not be familiar with the various standards, a couple things. So first of all, I think that the Mead standard, the Mead format that Mark was talking about is really interesting. And from the Berkeley perspective, that metadata, sort of the liner notes that we all used to be familiar with, and is a sort of really critical piece of information. So for example, taking that, and I think using some of the best practices that actually RDX is now experimenting with, as far as rather than having one singular database, how can we start putting information that is publicly available? So for example, a lot of the sort of publicly available metadata about music of, who played on it, or what kind of guitar did they use, et cetera. How can we experiment with some of that metadata? So to use the Mead standard, for example, use some of the best practices that RDX is also using, and not necessarily having one database, but having a distributed node of a distributed ledger of various data sets that are talking to each other. And then how can we enable, for example, startups and other applications to start building on top of that and doing interesting things? So we spoke about voice, for example. I have a 6 and just turned 9-year-old, and they're constantly interacting with Alexa in our kitchen and asking it questions about the music, and sometimes it gets it and sometimes it doesn't. And so I think that that's one really interesting use case, is how can we take some of the best practices that are out there, bring them together, and then allow the sort of top of stack development so that we can start experimenting with how music is both created and consumed today. And I'm really enthused, for example, to see the RIN standard going into the digital audio workstations. I'd love to, continue. I mentioned the supply chain. We have digital audio workstation creator, manufacturers within our membership as well. How can we help make some of those more intuitive? So one of the analogies that I use the most is TurboTax. So tax code's not simple, and yet there's been applications that have taken this sort of publicly accessible information and made it easy to access and easy to interact with for sort of any user. And I think that both on the creation and on the consumption side, that's where open music is going to continue to be value added.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to open up some questions to all of our panelists. One thing that we have not talked about today is the joint database effort of ASCAP and BMI, the performing rights organizations. So I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that effort, maybe contrast it with other past efforts, or...
I don't really know much about it, I'm afraid.
So perhaps someone else.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
And I can make a comment that my concern coming from I'm a label guy my whole life. Okay, disclaimer here. But one of the things that was done right in some of these initiatives is tracing the information back to the copyright owner. So for example, Sound Exchange has a policy that when they get a DDEX feed from a label, if they think there's something wrong, they kick it back to the label. They say, please correct it. You're the copyright owner or legal administrator of the copyrights, as the case may be. Please correct this and resend it. We are not going to mess with your data. So in a sense, they try to keep that data pristine. The unfortunate thing, especially for sound recording data, is that by the time it gets to ASCAP or BMI, it's pretty far from the source, and this is something that we can talk about later today. The further you get from the source, the less likely that that data is going to be accurate. And so that was my concern about ASCAP and BMI doing that without the involvement of the sound recording copyright holders.
I think one of the things that what David has just said points to, which we've sort of partly mentioned, but not specifically, is this issue of authority. That, in the context of the MLC database, or indeed any database, is the fundamental thing, is how authoritative is this? And one of the things that the industry hasn't done, which I think it really does need to consider doing in the not too distant future, is agreeing a set of authority rules around how do you determine whether a link between an ISWC and an ISLC is valid and can be relied upon. And you can turn that into machine rules, and the machines will do it for you, but you need human beings to agree what those rules are in determining the validity of a particular link. And then that can be applied to splits on works and a whole bunch of other things. But authority is the thing that we lack across the whole industry. Because at the moment, very simplistically, everybody who's got a database says, mine is the authoritative database and nobody else's is. And in the circumstances we find ourselves in, I would take exactly the same position. But actually, it's probably not true, because some of the data will be very authoritative because they've collected it very close to the source. If you think of a music rights society, a musical work rights society, they've got it from their own members. So PRS got data from a UK writer and a UK publisher. Likelihood that's probably right. But they'll also have data in there that they've got from Gamer about UK works, and the likelihood of Gamer getting it right, well, I'm not belittling Gamer, but the chances are slimmer. And so, all of these issues around authority we have got to tackle at some point as an industry. And until we do, we are going to continue along the sort of merry road of several databases, all purporting to do the same thing but looking different, being the norm.
Right. I mean, to give an example, so because we're in the weeds here and we're losing some people, I'm sure. It's not uncommon, for example, for a label to put a sound recording out into the marketplace. And let's just say it was a song, it was Jay-Z featuring Rihanna, Wembley Stadium 71 remix, whatever. It's like, okay, it's a pretty specific version of a song and so on and so forth. As it travels through the ecosystem, it is not uncommon for it to be changed to the point where when it comes back to the label that put it into the marketplace from a music licensing company, for example, a PRO or whatever, that it now says featured artist Rihanna, because it said featuring, so they assume that means that she's a featured artist, which in case you didn't understand, she's not, it's a Jay-Z track. And the version, which was live at Wembley 2014 remix, whatever, is now just gone. Maybe you get Wembley, or maybe you get a word, or maybe you get remix, but that's all gone. And unless, if you're really lucky, there's an identifier like an ISRC that you might be able to trace it back to the origin, now we're back to getting data coming back to the originator that they can't even recognize as their own. And that goes to Mark's point, which is you need to have an authoritative source that everybody can check against so they're all talking about the same thing.
Well, I guess in this case, it's a little bit different. We have a statutorily required MLC to be created database, right? So maybe let's focus a little bit on that. So I open this to all of the panelists. Is there adequate incentive for stakeholders to participate in the to be created MLC database?
Well, in simple terms, there is, because otherwise they won't get paid. That's the long and the short of it. Whether that's enough for everybody to participate is kind of difficult for me to say. And in a way, that incentive has been the same even with every PRO in the world, or every mechanical society, or even every producer society. Is if you don't register your stuff, you won't get paid. I think it's a little bit more stark here because of the blanket license, because there is no other way in which a license will get granted. I mean, I know that publishers, some of the bigger publishers, will do direct deals, but out of that, there isn't any other way that a license will be granted, and so there is a much more direct connection between those two things.
Nicole, did you have something
I
to
would
add?
add to that. I think that to your point, it's not going to be that different in that payments have been available in the past, and you were talking about people being surprised that there's this sort of like erroneous sound exchange, suspicious money coming to them. I think for the young and emerging creators, attribution and discoverability are just as important. And so I think that also remembering that while maybe it's $100 that's coming to them, and so perhaps it's not the financial incentive, but the attribution and the validation, not validation of data, but sort of validation of self and purpose and mission as an artist, and then discoverability. I think that those pieces are just as important, and so I think that remembering that those parts of the data sets and sort of the ability for services and applications to pull that data and use it in creative ways is also going to be incredibly important.
Are there any regulatory approaches that can be taken to provide further incentive?
I mean, my personal belief is, that I think that sort of human behavior versus rulemaking is, when you err on sort of human behavior and incentives, you're going to do better. But that's my own personal.
In the early days of Sound Exchange, actually, in our meetings here with the Copyright Office, there was some talk about whether there should be a regulation that you would not get paid if you didn't have an ISRC code to require ISRCs. And if you looked at the universe at that point, it meant the major labels would get paid because they had ISRCs for most of their releases, and most of the indies didn't. and it would have been horrible. I mean, from a political standpoint. So we didn't go with that kind of a regulation. Now, obviously, having registration or having that kind of a requirement would have been a good thing.
But we had a de facto regulation, which was iTunes decided that we wouldn't allow you to upload your sound recordings for sale on iTunes without an ISRC. And guess what? Overnight, everybody who wanted to get paid for their sound recordings made sure they had an ISRC.
Well, and I think that speaks to attribution as well, because you want to be on iTunes. Like, I think that, you know, it's the payment, yes, but it's also like you want to see like you want mom and dad, like I'm on iTunes.
Oh,
I mean, I've always felt the regulation around some of this stuff is always likely to be heavy-handed and will have unintended consequences. And, you know, so I think some of this still is stuff that has to be solved by the industry itself.
So, again, this is open to all of you, but beyond the MMA design and implementation choices, what has changed in the marketplace that might benefit or thwart successful development of the MLC database?
I think one of the things that fundamentally has changed, and this applies to my experience with DDEX, is the two sort of whammies of streaming and then voice-activated streaming. Those two things have concentrated the minds of C-level people around metadata and
What do you mean by C-level people?
CEO and COO and
CFOs.
them, especially them.
You actually have to pay for it.
It really has concentrated the mind about metadata process and infrastructure in a way that I have not experienced before, and I think those two things combined has had a really very positive effect on the way in which metadata and the sorts of things that we're talking about are now viewed within multinational companies. The CEO knows enough that this is important and that money needs to be spent on it to get it right, because it's going to seriously affect bottom lines.
I mean,
and their bonus. So
just to illustrate, so people say, Alexa, play 1970s soul music. So Spotify looks in the metadata they get from a label, and it says the release date is 2003, because that's the last time it went out on CD. And if there is a genre, well, how about 1970s disco music? Because disco is a genre that none of the labels ever used. They'll find nothing. Saturday Night Fever or the Bee Gees or whatever is going to say 2003 R&B. So it doesn't get paid. So now suddenly you're an executive at a label saying, wait a minute, we're not getting played. Pretty soon, 90% of our revenue is from streaming. If we're not getting paid, we're out of business. And that's how we came back to a new appreciation for the importance of metadata by the business executives.
I would say also, you know, and again, I think RDX is sort of a coming out of this distributed technology in general, and sort of the expectation of systems to talk to each other, I think has really evolved. And so it's not necessarily anymore that there's sort of this, you know, the clunky like message to message, and like it can take months before we even receive an error. I think that the ability and the expectation, not just within the music industry, but sort of in economies as a whole, for systems to quickly talk to each other, identify errors, and then be able to, you know, alert that is one piece. And I think that you know, that's sort of pushing the industry. And then the other piece is around just artificial intelligence and machine learning in general. And I think that those two elements are going to hopefully greatly expedite all of the efforts that are happening. And I think that the, you know, consumers and businesses are starting to expect that.
Yeah, so I want to expound on the first point. AI, we can just have a separate day for that. Oh, I forgot. We're having a separate day for that.
In February.
But MDX, going back to MDX, for example, when the message goes out and the claims come back in from publishers saying, yes, that's my writer, we own a share of this, if the splits add up to more than 100%, the MDX portal immediately is showing in real time, oh, no, we have 127% here. And in the old days, it would have taken weeks or months for all those emails to go around and somebody to add them all up and figure out that it's being overclaimed and so on. And so there is, that gives me hope that problems can be solved more quickly, and that processes can be developed to automate the solving of these problems. And the best practices to what do you do when it adds up to 110%? In the case of the best practice working group, they have decided that if the percentage is, Jay, help me, 110? 115. If the total percentage is under 115, then you prorate it down to 100 and you pay the payees and you try to figure it out later, rather than holding the money because it doesn't add up to 100%, which was standard industry practice previously.
I think also what has changed is the capacity of different person, different stakeholders to work together and to be around the table. And I think that DDEX is a good example. And what we can see now also, and it's quite new, is that the artist, the creator.
It didn't exist during GRD, and if it had, we might be in a different place. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, and now we are having the creator coming and participating. Before, it was the question of societies, publishers, they did not care about data, about their right, about so on. And now and they want to be involved, they want to participate, and I think because they are at the origin of the work, they are the creation, it's important that we are able to have all the different stakeholders from the beginning till the end of the value chain.
So speaking to that, so the standards and tools that we've talked about on this panel today, do they serve the needs of the vast majority of copyright owners who are like independent, or are we talking about just labels and publishers?
I mean, if I talk from a DDEX perspective, we are well aware that to implement a DDEX standard, you've got to have a half-decent IT facility. And that immediately cuts a lot of people out. So what you begin to see are services coming up that actually, and obviously things like the distributor community, are very much intended to be part of, be a solution for independence. We're very conscious of this. One of the things that we talk about in the relationship with OMI is whether particularly MIT guys can produce tools that enable people to kind of plug and play the DDEX standards rather than have to have an IT guy kind of build it for them. I mean, I'm not a technologist, so how realistic that is in practice, I don't know. But those are the sorts of areas that we've got to work on very hard over the coming years so that it is available to a much wider community than it currently, and realistically can be used by a much wider community.
Does anyone else have recommendations for how tools can be improved so that it does reach someone who's, making music in their garage?
I mean, I think that a commitment to creating those APIs is critical, and I think DDEX has certainly been doing that. And I'm not well versed enough in sort of where the MLC is going to know how that's going to play out. But I would say having an eye towards some basic APIs so that some of that data could be pulled is going to be really important, because then startups are monetarily incentivized to come up with a great solution, to come up with the TurboTax of the MLC.
But I think too, independents, especially smaller artists, have to go through aggregators to get on those services. You don't get on those services by making one-off deals. So it's incumbent upon those aggregators, CD Baby, whoever you're using, to create that technology in-house. Obviously, they'll compete on that.
And so the CD Babies of the world convert what they receive into DDEX messages to go to the DSPs. That's just the way it works. So.
Great. Any last words? Oh, I've been told I do not have an opportunity for any last words.
Stop is the last word.
I have to stop. Stop is the last word. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Really appreciate it.